You ever hear a name that wasn't supposed to exist? The question cut clean through the low hum of processors and quiet radio chatter, sharp enough to make two analysts glance up from their screens before quickly looking back down again, pretending not to listen, because in a room like this, deep inside a restricted command facility somewhere on U.S. soil, people learned fast which conversations were safe or ignored, and which ones carried weight they didn't understand. Chief Marcus Reed stood with his arms crossed, broad shoulders squared in a posture that had been trained into him through years of elite discipline, his Navy SEAL insignia catching the cold overhead light as he looked down at the old man seated near the secondary console, a man who didn't belong in a room filled with encrypted feeds, satellite overlays, and real-time mission tracking, a man in a faded field jacket that looked older than half the equipment in the building, his hands resting calmly on the edge of the desk as if the tension in the air had nothing to do with him. Outside the reinforced glass, the distant whir of a drone feed echoed softly through the speakers, a live operation unfolding somewhere thousands of miles away, measured in miles and seconds and decisions that couldn't be taken back. But inside this room, the focus had shifted, pulled towards something quieter, something harder to define. Reed tilted his head slightly, studying the old man with a mix of irritation and curiosity, the kind that came from someone used to being the most capable person in any room he walked into. "This isn't a public tour," he said, voice controlled but edged, "so I'll ask again, who are you supposed to be?" The old man didn't answer right away, didn't even look at him, his gaze fixed instead on one of the dim screens where a map flickered with shifting coordinates, as if he were listening to something beneath the noise, something deeper than the data, and that silence, steady, unbothered, seemed to bother Reed more than any response could have. A few feet away, Emily Carter paused mid-typing, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she glanced between them, sensing the shift in atmosphere, the subtle tightening that experienced operators recognized without needing it explained. Reed exhaled through his nose, stepping closer now, boots quiet against the polished floor. "Let's make this simple," he said, lowering his voice just enough to carry authority without raising it. "Everyone here has a designation, a call sign, something that tells me they belong. So what's yours?" For a moment, nothing moved, the room holding its breath in that strange way it sometimes did before something important happened, and then, slowly, the old man turned his head, his eyes clear despite the years etched into his face, calm in a way that didn't challenge but didn't yield either, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with age but steady as stone. "Ghost lead." The words didn't echo, didn't rise, they just settled into the room like they had always been there, like they had weight the walls themselves recognized, and for a fraction of a second, so brief most would have missed it, one of the monitors flickered, a signal recalibrating, a channel adjusting, as if somewhere deep in the system, something old had just been acknowledged again. The room did not react the way people usually did when a stranger spoke out of place. There was no laughter, no immediate pushback, just a subtle shift, like air pressure changing before a storm, and Emily Carter felt it first in the way her console flickered again, a brief pulse across the encrypted channel indicator that should not have moved at all because those systems did not respond to voices, they responded to authorization keys, layered protocols, verified identities, things that were logged and tracked and audited, yet something in the system had just acknowledged a phrase that had not been entered, had not been cleared, and that alone was enough to make her sit up straighter without realizing it. Chief Marcus Reed did not notice the screen at first, his attention locked on the old man, irritation tightening his jaw as if he had expected resistance, maybe even attitude, but not this quiet certainty, not a response delivered without explanation or effort, and for a moment he almost dismissed it entirely, another relic. Clinging to a past that no longer applied, except the room itself was not dismissing it, and that was what made the difference. One of the junior operators shifted in his chair, glancing at his neighbor before quickly looking back down, fingers slowing on the keyboard as the background systems continued their low mechanical rhythm, fans spinning, processors humming, but now there was something underneath it, something subtle, like a second layer of sound that had always been there but never noticed until now. Reed stepped closer, closing the distance by a few feet, his voice dropping just enough to carry authority without raising suspicion beyond the room. "That does not mean anything here," he said, though the words felt thinner than he intended, like they did not fully land, and that alone irritated him more than anything else, because control was not supposed to slip in a place like this. The old man did not respond, his attention still on the screen, eyes following the movement of a blinking coordinate marker as if he were reading something the rest of them could not, and that silence stretched again, longer this time, heavy but not uncomfortable to him, only to everyone else. Emily swallowed, her training telling her to ignore anomalies until confirmed, but her instincts, sharpened by years of watching patterns break, told her this was not random. She tapped a key, quietly pulling up a secondary diagnostic window, and there it was again, a line of text she had never seen populate on its own, a legacy channel identifier flashing briefly before fading back into the system, as if it had checked for something and then gone dormant. Her eyes widened just slightly, enough that she had to look down quickly to avoid drawing attention, but her mind was already moving, already connecting pieces that did not belong together, because legacy channels were not active, not in modern operations, not unless someone with very specific clearance had triggered them, and no one in this room had done that. Reed noticed the hesitation now, not on the screens but in the people, the micro-pauses, the slight delay in responses, and that was enough to push him forward again. You said it like it matters, he said, sharper now, testing, probing, trying to reassert control over a situation that felt like it was slipping sideways. So explain it. And this time the old man finally looked at him fully, not challenging, not defensive, just steady, like someone who had seen this moment play out before in different rooms, different years, different faces. And when he spoke, it was not louder, not forceful, just certain. If it did not matter, you would not be asking. And somewhere behind them, deep in the system where no one was supposed to be listening, a dormant channel opened for half a second longer than it should have, then closed again as if waiting for something else to follow. The words did not land like a challenge, they settled like a fact that had already been proven somewhere else, sometime long before this room existed, and that was what unsettled Chief Marcus Reed more than anything, because facts could not be pushed aside the way opinions could. He held the old man's gaze for a second longer, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would give him ground to stand on, but there was none, just that same calm presence that refused to rise to the tension being placed on it, and that refusal began to feel less like passivity and more like control. Behind them, Emily Carter's fingers moved again, faster now but quieter, pulling deeper system logs that were not meant to be accessed during an active operation, her eyes scanning lines of code and timestamps that did not match what should have been happening. Because the brief channel activation she had seen before was no longer a glitch, it was repeating, faintly, like a heartbeat buried under layers of modern architecture, something legacy, something old, something that had not been fully erased. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature control, because buried systems only came alive for one reason, recognition. Reed exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as if resetting himself, reclaiming the authority he had spent years earning. You are not in any registry I have access to, he said, more measured now, less sharp but more deliberate. No active designation, no retired listing, nothing that connects you to this operation. And as he spoke, he gestured slightly toward the surrounding consoles, the feeds, the layered intelligence flowing through the room. Everything here runs on verification, so if you expect anyone to take that seriously, you are going to need more than a name. The implication was clear. This was his ground, his system, his rules. The old man listened without interruption, then shifted his gaze back to the main display where the live feed flickered again, the drone camera adjusting altitude somewhere far away, its perspective tilting just enough to reveal a pattern in the terrain that most would miss, a subtle alignment of structures, shadows cast at angles that did not match the time of day displayed in the corner of the screen. And for the first time, he moved his hand, just slightly, pointing not at Reed, not at the people in the room, but at the screen itself. Your team is reading that wrong, he said quietly, not correcting, not criticizing, just stating, as if it were obvious. Reed frowned, irritation flashing again. We are not here for commentary, he replied, but Emily's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the section of the feed he had indicated, her mind racing as she overlaid the data with alternate parameters, and within seconds, a second pattern began to emerge, one that the automated systems had filtered out as noise, but which now formed something structured, intentional. She leaned forward unconsciously, her voice lower than before, almost to herself. That should not line up like that, and Reed heard it, turned slightly, catching the shift in her tone. the difference between routine observation and something else, something closer to recognition. The old man did not look at either of them now, his attention fully on the screen, as if the conversation had already moved past the point of needing to prove anything, and somewhere deep within the system, the dormant channel opened again, this time holding just long enough for a silent handshake to complete before disappearing once more, leaving behind a trace that no modern protocol could explain, only acknowledge. Emily Carter did not move at first, her eyes locked on the shifting overlay as new alignment markers populated across the screen, faint at first, then stabilizing into something deliberate, something that should not have been visible without manual override, and yet there it was, sitting quietly beneath the official interpretation, like a second language hidden inside the first. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper but steady enough to carry, "Sir, that pattern, it is not random." And this time Chief Marcus Reed did not dismiss it immediately, because he heard the difference, not just in her words but in the way the rest of the room had gone still, the subtle pause in keystrokes, the hesitation in breath, as if everyone had felt the shift even if they could not explain it. Reed stepped closer to the main display, narrowing his eyes as he studied the coordinates again, this time not trusting the automated overlay, not trusting the system that had always been reliable. Because now there was something else in play, something that had not come from his chain of command, and that alone demanded attention. "Run it again," he said, his tone controlled but tighter now, directed at Emily without looking at her, and she obeyed instantly, rerouting the feed through a secondary filter, stripping away the modern predictive layer, letting the raw data surface in a way it had not been displayed before. And when it did, the room shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that no one could pretend this was routine anymore. The structures aligned differently, the shadows fell into place with a logic that had been missed, and what had looked like scattered noise now formed a corridor, a pathway that cut through the terrain in a way that suggested intent, design, and timing. Reed's jaw tightened, because this was not part of the briefing, not part of the operational plan he had signed off on, and that meant one of two things: either the data was wrong, or someone in this room understood it better than the system itself. Behind him, the old man remained exactly where he was, posture unchanged, eyes steady on the screen as if this confirmation had been expected, not surprising, and that quiet certainty carried more weight now than before. Reed turned back toward him slowly, not with the same dismissive energy as earlier, but with something sharper, more focused. "You saw that before anyone else did," he said, not a question, more like a realization forming in real time, and for the first time, there was no sarcasm in his voice, only calculation. The old man did not answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the feed as the drone adjusted again, altitude shifting by a few hundred feet, the camera angle widening just enough to reinforce the pattern now visible to everyone, and when he finally spoke, it was the same calm tone, unchanged. "It has been there the whole time," and that was when Emily's console chimed softly, a sound so subtle it would normally be ignored, but not now, not after everything that had just happened. She looked down quickly, her breath catching as a new line appeared in the system log, not user generated, not automated, but recognized, a legacy authentication handshake that should not have existed in active operations, and yet it had just completed without error. Her fingers hovered over the keys, unsure for the first time in years, because she was looking at something that did not belong to her generation of systems, something older, deeper, and far more selective. Reed noticed the sound this time, his attention snapping toward her. "What was that?" he asked, and Emily hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "It is a channel authorization, but it is not ours," and the room went quieter than before, not from confusion now, but from the growing understanding that whatever had just been triggered did not need permission from anyone currently standing inside these walls. The words settled heavily in the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Chief Marcus Reed felt the shift in a way that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. It was something deeper, something instinctive, the kind of awareness that told him the rules he had been operating under no longer fully applied. He turned back toward the main display, eyes narrowing as the corridor pattern held steady, no longer flickering, no longer uncertain, as if it had locked into place once it had been recognized, and that recognition had not come from the system, it had come from the man standing behind him. "That channel," Reed said slowly, his voice lower now, measured, "where is it routing from?" And Emily Carter hesitated again, her fingers finally moving as she traced the signal path, deeper than she had clearance for, deeper than she had ever needed to go, and what she found made her stop entirely, her hand freezing above the keyboard as her eyes scanned the identifier string that should not have existed in any active database. It is not routing from anywhere current, she said carefully, choosing each word as if saying it wrong might break something fragile in the system. It is legacy authenticated, pre-modern architecture, and it is not requesting access, it is already recognized. And that distinction hung in the air like a line drawn between what was allowed and what simply was. Reed exhaled slowly, his posture shifting just slightly, not relaxed, but recalibrated, because he understood systems, he understood authority, and anything that bypassed both without resistance was not something to ignore. Behind him, the old man remained still, but now there was a subtle change, not in his stance, but in the way the room seemed to orient around him. As if the center of gravity had shifted without anyone acknowledging it directly, the drone feed adjusted again. Altitude stabilizing at just under 2,000 feet, the camera angle widening to reveal the full corridor pattern, and for a moment, the room forgot to speak, forgot to move, because what had once looked like scattered terrain now clearly formed a route, one that avoided detection, one that moved through the environment with intention, and it was not part of the official plan. Reed stepped closer to the console, his voice firm again, but different now, less about asserting control and more about understanding it. If that path is correct, our team is not positioned for it, he said, half to Emily, half to himself, and Emily nodded without looking away from the screen, already recalculating, already adjusting overlays. They are reading the primary route, not this one, she replied, her tone tighter now, because the implication was clear. The difference between those two paths was not just data, it was outcome. The old man finally moved again, just a small step forward, enough to stand beside the console without asking permission, his presence neither intrusive nor hesitant, simply there, and when he spoke, it was the same quiet certainty, unchanged by the tension around him. They will adjust if you tell them where to look. And Reed turned his head slightly, not fully facing him, but no longer ignoring him either. And how exactly would we do that, he asked, not mocking this time, not dismissing, just direct. The old man's eyes shifted briefly to the communication panel, then back to the screen. That channel is already open, he said, and for the first time since this began, Reed did not respond immediately, because he knew what that meant. It meant the system was not waiting for permission, it was waiting for instruction, and the realization settled in slowly, heavy and undeniable, that whatever had been triggered by those two words was not a glitch, not an error, but a doorway that had just been quietly unlocked. For a moment, no one moved, not because they did not understand what he had said, but because they understood it too well, and Chief Marcus Reed felt that realization settle in his chest like weight, steady and undeniable, the kind that did not need to be explained twice. His eyes shifted from the communication panel back to the old man, measuring, recalculating, not as an outsider anymore, but as a variable he had failed to account for, and that failure mattered now, because everything in this room was built on precision, and this was something beyond it. Emily Carter's fingers hovered over the console, her training telling her to wait for authorization, for a command structure that had always dictated the next step, but the system in front of her was not waiting. The channel remained open, quiet, stable, as if it had been designed to exist outside the usual chain, and she felt a strange certainty that if it closed, it would not reopen easily. Sir, she said softly, not looking at Reed this time, her eyes fixed on the interface. It is holding, it is not timing out, and that alone broke the last layer of hesitation in the room. Reed inhaled slowly, his posture straightening, the decision forming before he spoke it, because hesitation here was no longer neutral, it was risk, and he had not earned his position by ignoring risk. Patch it through, he said. The words controlled, deliberate, and for a fraction of a second. Emily froze, not from doubt, but from the awareness that she was stepping outside every standard protocol she had been trained to follow, and then she moved, her fingers pressing the command, routing the dormant channel into the active communication stream. The room did not change immediately, there was no dramatic sound, no visible signal, just a subtle shift in the audio layer, a second frequency blending into the existing feed, almost imperceptible unless you were listening for it, and the old man stepped forward the final inch, positioning himself in front of the console as if he had always belonged there. Reed did not stop him, did not question it, because something in the room had already answered that question for him. The drone feed flickered again, not unstable, but responsive, as if it were waiting, and somewhere far beyond the walls of this facility, beyond the miles and time zones that separated them, a faint transmission carried through the open channel, not words at first, just the subtle rhythm of a live connection, the unmistakable presence of someone on the other end. The old man leaned slightly toward the microphone, not hurried, not tense, just precise, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not command, it settled into the channel with the same quiet authority it had carried from the beginning. Adjust 2 degrees east, hold altitude, follow the shadow line, and the room froze, not because of the instructions themselves, but because of what happened next. On the main display, the drone responded, not after a delay, not after confirmation, but immediately, its angle shifting, its path aligning with the corridor that had only just been revealed, and Emily's breath caught as the system updated in real time, recognizing the adjustment as valid, as authorized, as if it had come from the highest level of command. Reed's gaze snapped back to the old man, something unspoken passing through his expression, not confusion, not disbelief, but the first clear recognition that this was no longer a question of who the man was, but what the system already knew him to be. And for the first time since the words had been spoken, the room did not feel like it belonged to the present anymore. It felt like it had just connected to something that had never truly gone away. The adjustment held, not for a second or two, but steadily, the drone maintaining its new path as if it had always been meant to follow it, and that consistency was what changed everything inside the room, because systems could glitch, they could flicker, they could misread data, but they did not sustain precision without validation, and yet this one was doing exactly that. Emily Carter's hands moved again, faster now, pulling live telemetry, cross-referencing inputs, verifying that what they were seeing was not an anomaly, and every line confirmed the same impossible truth. The command had not just been accepted, it had been integrated, treated as primary instruction by a system that should have rejected anything outside its authorized structure. It is stable, she said quietly, almost to herself, her voice carrying just enough for the others to hear. No conflict, no override warnings. It is acting like this is the original directive, and that sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it meant the system was not adapting to him, it was recognizing him. Chief Marcus Reed stood still, eyes fixed on the screen, but his focus had shifted inward, processing layers of implication faster than he could articulate them, because everything he had been trained to trust was now being rewritten in real time, not by force, not by command, but by presence, behind the glass. The rest of the facility continued its quiet operations, unaware that inside this room the chain of authority had just bent without breaking. Reed finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that cut through the silence. Who else has access to that channel? And Emily shook her head immediately, not even needing to check this time. No one current, she replied, her certainty absolute now. There are no active credentials tied to it, nothing in the modern system, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before adding, it should not exist in an operational state. And that was when Reed looked back at the old man fully, not as a disruption, not as a variable, but as the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. The old man did not acknowledge the shift directly, his attention still on the feed, watching the terrain unfold as the drone followed the corridor, each movement precise, each adjustment minimal, as if guided by something that did not need correction. The communication channel remained open, quiet but alive, and then, faintly, a voice came through, distant but clear enough to carry intent, not confusion, not panic, just controlled acknowledgement from the team in the field, responding to the adjusted path as if it had been briefed that way from the beginning. Emily's breath caught again, because that was the final piece, the confirmation that whatever had been activated here was not isolated, it extended outward, connecting across distance and time in a way that bypassed explanation entirely. Reed took a slow step back, not retreating, but recalibrating his position in a room that no longer operated under his sole authority, and for the first time, there was no resistance in the movement, only recognition. The old man spoke again, just a few words, quiet, precise, and the drone adjusted once more, perfectly, seamlessly, as if the instruction had come from its own design. No one in the room spoke after that, not because they had nothing to say, But because they understood that whatever was happening here was already speaking for itself, and the only thing left to do was listen. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room with a weight that no one tried to interrupt, because by now every person inside understood that whatever was unfolding had already moved beyond protocol. Beyond rank, beyond anything written into manuals or briefings, the drone feed continued its steady glide across the terrain, the corridor now fully realized, no longer a theory, no longer a hidden pattern, but a path that had been there long before any of them had seen it, and the man standing at the console guided it without effort, without hesitation, as if he had walked that path himself in another time. Under different skies, Chief Marcus Reed stood just behind him now, not crowding, not asserting, his posture still straight but no longer rigid, the edge in his presence replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect than he would have admitted even a few minutes earlier, and his eyes did not leave the screen, not because he needed to verify what was happening, but because he needed to understand it, to find some anchor in a moment that refused to fit into anything familiar. Emily Carter kept working, but her movements had changed, slower now, more deliberate, as if she were documenting something that might never be repeated, capturing each system response, each silent acknowledgement, because part of her knew this was not just an anomaly, it was a reference point, something future systems would be built around without ever fully explaining why. The channel remained open, stable, and the distant voices on the other end had shifted too, their tone aligned with the adjustments. No longer questioning the path, no longer hesitating, just moving forward with a confidence that mirrored the calm in the room, as if they had fallen into a rhythm that had existed long before this mission began. Then, without warning, the secured door at the far end of the command room opened with a sharp, controlled motion, not rushed, not chaotic, but decisive enough to cut through the stillness like a blade, and every head turned at once, not out of habit, but because instinct recognized authority before the mind could process it. Admiral Scott Whitaker stepped in, his presence immediate, unmistakable, the kind of authority that did not need to be announced because it carried itself in every movement, every step measured, every detail precise, his uniform immaculate under the cold lighting, his eyes scanning the room with a focus that missed nothing. Who authorized the legacy channel activation? He demanded, his voice firm, controlled, carrying across the room without rising, and for a split second, no one answered, not because they did not know, but because they understood that the answer was standing only a few feet away from him. Whitaker's gaze moved quickly from station to station, reading the room the way a seasoned commander does, not just the screens, but the people, the posture, the silence, and then it stopped, locking onto the old man at the console, and in that instant, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, a flicker of recognition that did not belong to this moment but had been carried into it. The Admiral took one step closer, his expression tightening, not in anger, not in confusion, but in realization, and the room held its breath as the space between authority and history collapsed into a single, quiet point. The distance between them closed without a word, Admiral Scott Whitaker stepping forward until he stood just behind the old man, close enough to see the subtle movement of his hands over the console, close enough to recognize the posture, the stillness, the quiet precision that no training manual could replicate, and for a moment, the authority he carried did not disappear, but it shifted, aligning itself with something older. Something earned long before this room was ever built, the drone feed continued its steady path across the terrain, the corridor now fully navigated, the system updating in real time with a clarity that had not existed before, and the voices on the channel settled into a calm rhythm, each response measured, each movement aligned with the guidance they were receiving, as if the uncertainty that had once been there had simply dissolved. Whitaker's eyes remained fixed on the man at the console, the recognition no longer subtle now, no longer hidden, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not a demand, not a question, but something closer to confirmation. I thought that channel was decommissioned, and the old man did not turn, did not acknowledge the statement directly, his attention still on the screen as the final adjustments played out. Systems change, he said quietly, patterns do not, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any explanation could have. Chief Marcus Reed stood a few steps back, watching the exchange unfold, the shift in the room now complete, because the presence of the Admiral had not restored the old order, it had confirmed the new one, and that realization settled in with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Emily Carter's console chimed one last time, softer than before, a closing tone that marked the end of the active adjustment, and on the main display, the drone leveled out, its path stabilized, the corridor behind it now just another line in the system, recorded, archived, but understood in a way it had not been before. The channel remained open for a few seconds longer, the distant voices offering a final acknowledgement, steady and composed, before the signal faded back into the quiet hum of the room, and with it, the subtle presence that had filled the space began to recede, not disappearing, but settling back into something less visible, less immediate. Whitaker straightened slightly, his posture returning to its familiar form, but there was a difference now, a quiet respect that had not been there when he entered, and without hesitation, without announcement, he raised his hand in a precise, deliberate motion, offering a salute that was not required, not expected, but given anyway. The room froze, not from command, but from understanding, because in that single gesture, everything that had happened found its place, every unanswered question, every unexplained system response, every silent recognition. The old man paused for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not returning the salute, not needing to, before stepping back from the console as if his part in this had already been completed long ago. No one spoke as he moved toward the door, his steps unhurried, his presence no longer questioned, and as the door closed quietly behind him, the room remained still for just a second longer, holding on to the moment before returning to motion, to routine, to the systems and structures that defined it. But something had changed, something that would not be written into any report or stored in any database, only remembered by the ones who had seen it, and in the quiet that followed, the realization lingered, steady and certain, that respect was never commanded, it was recognized, and some names were never meant to be forgotten.